Welcome to the Why Not podcast with me, Chrissy Hawkins. In a world where everybody asks you why, I'm here to ask why not. So sit back and relax or walk and listen and join me on this journey as we try to answer this never-ending question: what makes people say, why not? Hi guys, welcome back to Why Not. So today I am having a great interview with Linn Thornsonson. So she works with people who have disordered eating and that kind of area of nutrition. And it turned into a really interesting conversation that we had. Like, she worked with horses as well before going into this line of work. So we kind of discussed a bit about that, but we also just talk about it in general as well. And yeah, really, really interesting conversation. So I hope you've really enjoyed it. Hi guys, welcome back to Why Not. Today I have Linn Thornsonson with me. Linn is a nutritional therapist and body image coach. And to tell you all a little bit more about that, I'm going to let Linn do that. So welcome to the podcast, Linn. How are you?
Thanks, Chrissy, and thanks for having me. Yeah, that's always those challenging questions, like describe what is it you actually do. But I think the short answer would be that I specialize in helping people heal or repair their relationship with food, eating, and their body. And that can take different forms depending on what people need and where they're at.
Okay, so firstly, how did you get into this?
Do you want the long story? Do you want the sort of compressed version?
No, I
Otherwise
want the
people be
long
here all
story. I
day.
want the full thing, warts and all.
So I suppose a big part of why I ended up retraining as a nutritionist is because of my own lived experience with eating issues. And I would say at the peak times, I probably would have fitted the criteria for binge eating disorder, even though at at my worst, that was pre the official diagnosis and the DSM-5, which only came out in 2013. So that's kind of how I would say. But before, after, like disordered eating and body image struggles and some chronic dieting thrown in there for good measure. It's like quite chaotic and messy at times for my late teens into my mid-20s, I would say. But before I became a nutritionist, I was working with horses and I was working in racing yards and stud farms, and both here in Ireland, in Sweden, where I grew up before I came to Ireland, and then did a couple of stints in Australia as well. And it was kind of in my mid-20s, I was getting a bit tired of shoveling shit for a living, if you want to put it mildly. Yeah, and I wanted options because when I finished secondary school, I was quite tired of studying, so I needed a break. And the break went on from like 19 into my mid-20s, and I was thinking maybe I need to get myself an education so I have choice. And because I was in this mess of elaborating or experimenting with food and restricting and binge eating and all sorts of stuff, I'd read loads of books around nutrition and eating and diet plans. And I was like, maybe I should just make this my career. Wouldn't that be grand? I spent so much time doing this already anyway. So that's kind of how it happened. But initially I trained as a nutritional therapist, so more focus on helping people change their diets to support their physical health. That was kind of like the more sort of the starting point. But as I got into that, I noticed like that people's relationship with food was actually quite complex and complicated, and it wasn't as easy as sort of giving somebody instructions, say, hey, you should increase this and maybe reduce that, and we'd get an odd client where that would work, but to get people where that could throw them even further it was complicated. So I thought, there's something going on here. I need some more training. I need to understand this emotional connection to food. And now, actually, as I say that, I realize it's kind of interesting because at that time I was fairly well into my own recovery. But I didn't connect that my own lived experience kind of connected with what I was seeing or how that was connected with what was showing up in my clinic. But as I went on this new trajectory in the direction of understanding the dynamic we have with food, with how we eat, why we eat and the relationship we have with our body. It's kind of over time really circled back, seeing, I think, and really deepened my own healing in understanding why certain things happen in certain ways that I didn't understand at the time it was happening, and even how I navigated my own recovery by myself. So that's kind of how it works. And so now I work primarily with people around the relationship with food and their body.
Yeah, that's really cool. And when you talk about your own recovery and stuff like that, was there like a time where you can say that you kind of realized that what you were doing was kind of like destructive in a way? Like, it wasn't helping you get to where you wanted to be.
Yeah, and I think that's a really this is such a great question, because it's really kind of like there's times like how I looked at that from within myself towards myself changed, because there would have been times where you say, okay, where did I want to be? Well, I would say I wanted my body to look a certain way. I wanted my aesthetics to be a certain way, or my weight to be a certain number. And that was the dynamic. And then I was like thinking, well, what's wrong with me? And why can't I get this under control? And it went on and off like that for quite a number of years. And sometimes I might lose weight because maybe I was very active because I had a physical job. Maybe I changed how I was eating. Sometimes I was restricting maybe more. And then I couldn't keep that up. And then I was binging. And I was also living abroad. I had times where my job was really miserable. So then food became a coping mechanism. And then I got to a point where I remember I'd gone through a period of just becoming more aware of how I was eating and noticing certain patterns, but I wasn't changing them. But simultaneously, alongside that, I was also on and off the scales all the time. And then I just got to a point where, why am I doing this? It's really exhausting. And it wasn't like the more I was gripping for what I wanted to try to make the scale say, the more it was going up, and the less, and then the worse I was feeling, and the more out of control I was feeling, and the more self-loathing was heaped on. And I was like, it's just really all exhausting. And I'm not sure this is, and I think what happened was like, I had this sort of like a light bulb moment, was like, this isn't making me happy. Why am I tying my happiness to, particular to this number? It wasn't even like, oh, I want to feel a certain way in my body. It was like, I will be happy when the scale says this number. I was like, that's ridiculous. And I think that was the starting point. I was like, I'm not going to tie my happiness to a number, because that just doesn't make sense anymore. So that
Yeah.
was kind of like a huge shift. And I really had to get off the scales. And even though that's, going on almost 20 years now, I would say in these last 15, 20 years, the amount of times I weighed myself, you could probably count to one hand, because it's still a very kind of contentious point, because it's amazing. It's like, even in the back of my mind, I'm thinking the scale should, if I get on it, should show a certain number, which is ridiculous, but it's still there. And I suppose I own it, which is why I kind of really limit the amount of time I get on a scale, because it's just not worth it for my mental well-being.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting you say that because it's very true. Like so many people do kind of tie their self-worth to something on the scales. And like yourself, I would have been someone who was a bit like that. Like it resonates so much with me. But now I would weigh myself the odd time. But you even do notice, like, even now I'm totally comfortable with whatever weight I am. If it's a little bit lower, you do feel that little bit of, hey, I never really care when it goes up, but when it goes down, you still have that. And you're like, it's still, you just can't get rid of it really, can you?
No, no, it's so deep rooted. And I think as well, the recovery from an eating disorder, disordered eating, would be much easier if we didn't live in a society that was continuously reinforcing these same messages that we're trying to undo, that we've internalized. So that just makes it harder. And I think if you have a history of eating issues, you're always going to be more vulnerable as well. So you really have to be aware of that as your body changes over the years, like say, particularly for us who are women, we know puberty is like top prime like time of a woman's life for where, eating disorders can get a foothold. Pregnancy, postpartum is another one, and then perimenopause and menopause is another one. And I wonder, because our bodies are naturally obviously changing through those times, but we also have hormonal changes that can affect our mood. So I'm kind of curious actually how much the hormones also increase the vulnerability alongside the body changes that naturally occur at that time as well.
Yeah, it's like, well, it makes sense when you think about it, because like hormones can affect your mood so greatly. And if you are in that kind of vulnerable, maybe you're feeling very sensitive, you're feeling, and then you have social media or advertising telling you, if you are not this, there's something wrong with you. Like it's really gonna like kind of push
Yeah.
over the edge sometimes.
Yeah, and when our bodies are changing, that brings its own kind of discomfort because our brain has to readjust to how it's experiencing our body in space. So that brings its own discomfort. So particularly when weight changes, the body changes are quite rapid, it's more difficult, I think, than if it's very gradually and slow. Like my body has changed a good bit over the last maybe 4 years, 4 or 5 years, but it's been because I obviously noticed in my clothes and I'm like, oh, this doesn't really fit that well anymore. And maybe it's like, yeah, maybe I need to get a bigger pair of pants. But it's been so gradual that I haven't noticed it as much in myself. It's only when I have tried on something that I could wear 3 years ago that now I can't do up the button on. And I was like, huh. So like in terms of how I feel inside my body, that hasn't changed as much.
Yeah, that's the main thing, isn't it, really?
It is, I think, but it's like you still have to watch it though, because it's like, you put on these clothes and it's like, oh, they don't fit. And I suppose I did realize how far I've come in my own journey when I just didn't freak out the way I would have maybe 15 years ago, where that would have been like a complete disaster and a panic of what am I going to do about it? And you can't fix it. And even if we're trying to say, quote unquote, fix it by restrictive diets, the change doesn't happen that quickly anyway, if things have been gradually changing. So, but it's like, oh, okay, this feels a bit uncomfortable. And oh, here we go again with these old thoughts, but they're so much more subtle now than they have been, which is nice.
Yeah, and it's interesting you talking about that way as well, like because I suppose when it comes to stuff like that, like, clothes not fitting, it's kind of like not like you chose for that to happen. So, for instance, like there's things like I'm in my 30s now, and there's like I was going through my wardrobe a while ago and I was chucking out all these dresses. And my mom was like, oh, why are you throwing them out? You have the figure for them, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, yeah, I know, but I'm not 21 anymore. I'm not wearing that because I look ridiculous. I'm not going to clubs or anything like that. And it's like when it's that, I think it's easier to let go, isn't it? Because you're like, well, I'm not going to do that anymore. Whereas if it's a body change, it kind of, you're not in control then, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, and that's true because I also think about clothes and when we change our clothes like a skin, like you grow and evolve, right, as a person and your interests change or even how you want to dress changes. It's like a skin. But if I'm getting rid of clothes just because they're worn out or because I don't like the style anymore, that's a bit different when I realize, oh, these pants just don't fit actually anymore. So, or this dress that I would like to wear or that I liked doesn't really fit that well anymore. And there was a person I follow on Instagram for quite a good one. She's in her late 30s and she did a really good reel of how she dealt with that, which I thought it was so nice to see somebody talking about that because if it is within our means and it's possible, like tailoring those favorite clothes that we might have grown out of can be an option. So I thought that was a nice thing to think about too. because we don't always think about that. We might think about mending clothes that we like, that's there's a hole on or whatever. But we might not think about, oh, actually, I could go to a tailor and get them to put a bit of elastic in the waist, and now actually might fit again. It's fine. So there is those things I think that we can that's worth thinking about too, and how we do that. But I think for most of it is though, it's like how we think about ourselves and the meaning we make of the fact that the pants don't fit anymore.
Yeah.
And if we just see it as like it's just a neutral thing, and like you said, it's like we don't have as much control over it as we think, then it's not the end of the world. Whereas when we make a big meaning out of it, like about who we are and what we are and all of those things, then it's much more dramatic and much harder to deal with, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just coming back to when you were saying, you're working in yards, you're working in a really physical job and stuff like that, and racing yards, and you had your own kind of eating kind of issues. Did you find that? Do you think that ever affected your working and how you were able to perform in the job?
That's a really good question. Um, I think there would have been times, and I think the initial things that really sort of set me on a path of disordered eating was like I think I was about 16, and at the time I was working weekends and stuff in a riding school that also had racehorses, and I was got the opportunity to break in this 2-year-old and ride her and stuff. And somebody I think that was envious of me, who was actually a good bit older, said something to me about my weight and that I was getting too heavy for riding the horse. And obviously, these are young horses, so they don't want to be carrying that much weight. But like, I wasn't that heavy. But that was kind of like that planted the seeds, because before that, I can't remember thinking that much about my body at all. But your question then is like, yeah, when I moved to Ireland, I was 20 and I had just been really busy and I'd been food poisoned a month or so before I came. So it was quite light and probably a bit undernourished. And then bit like when people go to college or move out of home for the first time, when you travel and you move to a different country and you live there, it's really normal that you gain weight because there's lots of new foods you want to try out. There is, you might feel a bit homesick, so you might comfort eat a bit, but it doesn't mean that there's any pathologically wrong with that. Like that's kind of a normal trajectory. So what happened was, like, I was working away and I was busy. I think we were writing about 5 lots a day. So it was quite physical, but I still managed to arrive there and gain probably a stone in 6 months, because by the time I went home for Christmas that year, there was clothes that didn't fit. And because I was still in this kind of stuff with my body, it really threw me. And then through that, I then sort of carried on the cycle of like dieting and stuff. But because I was riding big national hunt horses. They carry big lads, even in races. So in that aspect, I don't think it didn't matter that my weight was fluctuating. I think there was probably times that I was more stressful, and because then one of the jobs I had was really like emotionally stressful. Um, Probably leaned on food a lot more than I would have if I'd had a healthy relationship with food. So it added a lot more stress into my life that weren't necessary. And my own sort of internalized discomfort and stuff added more shame onto stuff that just wasn't, I think that I could have maybe done without. But I think also when you're in your 20s, there's a huge learning growth that happens personally throughout that whole decade. So I suppose I'm lucky enough that I came out of it okay in the end.
Yeah, and with like working in racing yards, I know there's stress and all that. Like obviously with the jockeys, they have weights they need to make. did that ever like filter down into you guys as well and kind of thinking of it, or the horses were just you're just riding the horses, it's fine?
Yeah, no, it didn't. That didn't matter, and I think it mattered a lot less because I was riding primarily national hunt horses, so they're big, they're older as well. Even when they go into training, well, 20 years ago they didn't used to start them off until they were 4 or 5 even. I know, and they start them much earlier now. But so and like some of them were huge, so it wasn't that like we weren't as exercise riders and stuff. We were never like had to be weighed or anything, thankfully. So there was none of that. And it was mostly my own internal life stuff, really. And when my body would change, or especially if I gained weight, it could be more, I might feel more uncomfortable and less flexible and things like that. And that might have an effect. Or I suppose obviously if I wasn't eating enough either, then it would make you a bit weak. So, it'd be harder to hold on to to one that'd be
Yeah,
you know, running away with you around the gaps. So.
it's one of those sports that you really don't want to be underfueled, isn't it?
No, and I remember I was reading what's your man's name? The famous guy, Anthony McCoy, his autobiography years ago. And like Jesus, there was times he was riding like 7 or 8 races and he was subsiding on like I don't know, 10 sugar cubes and several bits of tea, and they'd be doing, hot baths, or often they'd be doing sweating out pounds and stuff. It's insane because it's not like just you that you're trying to manage. So these guys go out there sometimes undernourished, dehydrated, and like riding these 600-kilo animals at 35, 40 kilometers an hour speed over jumps on sometimes really tiny little saddles. And like if something happens to you, but like you can bring down a whole bunch of other people in the process too. So like it's a bit insane.
Yeah,
Um,
it's one thing with the fighters, fighters have to cut, and a lot of them have to do it and they get weighed the day before. So then they literally eat everything around them to do it. But again, they're just in charge themselves. If they have a lapse in judgment, they might get a wallop in the face. But
yeah, but this
it's
is a whole other danger. And I mean, there is continues, like I'm not really in the sport anymore, so I don't hear these conversations, but there's been conversations like even for the flat, should they be bringing up like the minimum weight? And also I think like should technically the horses be a little bit older than what they are, because particularly on the flat, they're very young. Some of them are, just over 2 years old, like the horses aren't fully grown or anything. So there's a whole kind of like some ethical considerations in the racing industry, which I know this is taken away from our conversation, but it's
right.
like that sometimes can find hard to hear when you've given a lot of your life to a sport and you're there looking after the animals on the ground. And if you work for a good yard, the horses get really good treatments. Like they're athletes basically, so they get pampered. But if you're working in a place where maybe the owners aren't that, paying that well, or there's a lot of animals and there's not a lot of staff and things get missed, and it's just everybody is tired all the time because they're overworked and underpaid and don't get enough time to rest, then, and if there's a lot of push, just like we have to, get them to the races no matter what. And, there obviously are lots of rules and things around regulations for
Oh
what you
yeah.
can and cannot do, but it's still like because of people, as you know, as somebody who's a equestrian yourself, it's like most people, not everybody, but a lot of people who get into that, they do it because they love the animals. So the stable staff on the ground often give a lot of their life to look after these animals and to do it well. So it's hard then when you hear people criticizing, and I mean, I understand this, so criticism is justified too. But for the people who are working most closely with the animals, like they also need to be recognized for what they do, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, like we're talking about the regulations there, and like I was thinking about this here when we were talking about like AP McCoy just only having like a couple of sugar cubes and tea. Like again, all the regulations for like the horse welfare and stuff is always about the horse, which, absolutely, like if a horse showing signs of soreness, they shouldn't be running. They've brought in like, they've really strict crop laws and stuff like that. But there's no regulations of the guy who's like, riding the horse who should probably eat because it will help his cognitive function. All these things, disable people as well. Like, race days are long days and you can have lots of stuff, lots of horses, 12, 13 hours a day. They're eating feck all through the day as well.
I know. Yeah, and I that's actually a good point. And I do believe like even some of the regulations around like taking care of the jockeys and stuff like that's gotten better. And then when I was working racing like 20 odd years ago, like you're right, like race days could be really long and often people wouldn't get like a day off the following day. And they say, racing is usually on Sundays. That's like when people are off. Or, I worked in yards as well. We had pointers. That's also on Sundays. And it's all fine, like when you're in your early 20s and you love what you do for a few years, and then you kind of go, oh, yeah, but like I like a day off, or I'd like to get paid properly so I don't have to scrape by because it's so hard and so many hours and stuff. And I think there is a bit more like regulation now that you can't. I think it was Aidan O'Brien, they got caught, a few years ago, and they were even in court saying, well, people have to have, if people have been to the races, like they basically have to have a day off the following day. And some of the arguments were like, because often in race yards, people would look after maybe 3 to 6 horses, maybe. And if you ride out, if you ride them as well, you want to, of course, ride them. And they were like, yeah, but these people care about the horses and they don't want to be missing out. So it's like, yeah, that's fine. And we get that, but people also need breaks, proper breaks. So that's there. And like, if you ever been like backstage, say to the stable yards on a racetrack, like there tends to be stable, like jockeys canteens and stable for the stable stuff, but like the food is like quite poor and the choices are quite poor and limited. So yeah, it's like eating well is hard or harder, I think,
I think that's a
So
big
yeah.
thing across the whole industry. Like, you go to shows and not saying that there's anything wrong with them, but like you have a burger van, you're out for the whole day. People don't, they'll have water and they'll have, things for their horses for the breaks and stuff like that, but it's never for them. And it's a big issue they have.
Yeah, because again, even if you're just competing for like for fun on a hobby level, like you probably still need to eat like all day, and then it's like, yeah, there's a few chips you can have. That's about it, like, or a
Yeah.
burger or something, cup of tea and a bar of chocolate. That's kind of about it, isn't it?
No wonder there's issues.
Yeah.
So coming back to kind of the people you work with and stuff like that, when you started, so you say kind of talking about how you started seeing things like not being so black and white, not just remove this and change that. What, like, what kind of things were you seeing maybe?
Yeah. I mean, I could tell you, I suppose what was I seeing? Like sometimes that people would, I think it's like what I didn't realize at the time is that even when we are like trying to make changes from a place of care, if that's not where we are at mentally, then it becomes like changes from a place of fear or from a place of restriction. And often the restriction sort of backfires into emotional eating or binge eating. Or I didn't realize maybe at the time, even though I'd done it myself, that I suppose I wasn't equipped to work with people's relational aspect of food. So if somebody was eating something at times outside what, in the car between work and home, or I said they were eating a lot of sugar food, and I wasn't trained to be curious about, well, what's going on here? And it's so easy to just go, okay, we'll just have to take that out and focus on this thing. And if if we do those behaviors for a reason, usually to keep ourselves safe or try to meet some kind of need, even if it's become dysfunctional, we can't just rip it out because we need to put something else in place. And that's a process. So I think I saw that and I still see that, but I think what I also see a lot of is like all this internalized fat phobia right across the board, no matter what sort of size body somebody lives in, and the fear of weight gain or the feel that I have to control my body or I have to lose weight or I have to, and because a lot of that is becomes so intertwined with how we view health, that health has a specific look, which of course isn't true, but that's kind of there as well. So those are quite common patterns.
Yeah, is there a certain age group that you would see this more in, or is it kind of across the board?
It's actually quite across the board. So I currently work with people from like 16 to 60, I would say. It's probably the age group. And you know what? The biggest difference is that the person who is like, say, between 16 and 25, they have not been doing it for as long as the person who is in their 40s or 50s. That's the biggest difference. And that can sometimes be harder. And I do like to say to my younger clients, like, it's so great that you're starting on this journey now, because I also work with people who are like 20 or 30 years older than you, and they've been doing this for all of that time. And they're like, wow, I couldn't imagine, because usually by the time people come in, the pain point and the struggle is kind of get to a place where like, I can't do this anymore, but I don't know what's next. So I think people who are like in their 40s or 50s, particularly people who's been in the cycle of chronic dieting, mightn't meet a criteria for a specific eating disorder, but it's kind of on and off, on and off, on, and they might have been gaining, losing the same 20 pounds over 30 years. And it's almost like there hasn't been enough conversation around that this is a problem, or like this is something that you don't have to be doing. And also, it's not something, there's nothing wrong with you. It's not a you problem, it's a cultural kind of problem as well, that contributing to why we think we need to be doing this on and on.
Oh,
And that's happening more now, I think, than it has been.
Yeah, there's a massive industry though that like completely lives off this. Like, obviously you've been in the nutrition space. There's a lot of charlatans, or not even charlatans. Sometimes they believe what they're saying, but they don't really realize that they have an eating disorder. Same thing I see the fitness industry, like how many sales pitches are lose weight.
Oh gosh, yeah. Yeah, I had a really interesting conversation with somebody last week, who's a guy who's also a fitness instructor and has been on his own journey from kind of getting out of the whole weight loss into a more weight inclusive approach. And that was really interesting because he's also said, like, yeah, the fitness world in and of itself is really challenging space, and sort of is a breeding ground for disordered eating behaviors, I think. And it's not always a welcoming place if you don't have a body that sort of fits into the stereotype of what a body that goes to the gym should look like. And I think it's a barrier then too, because sure, that then if you like lifting weights, or you like sitting on a spinning bike, or you like being in that environment, like that shouldn't be a barrier technically, though. Like if that's how you enjoy moving your body, even if you're whatever size your body is. But I also feel like sometimes there's like it feels like there's such a culture that it's almost like, well, if you don't go to the gym, there's no other ways you can also move your body.
I agree. Yeah.
It's like with this or that. And maybe because I grew up in the countryside and not in a town or a city, I was never really influenced by that culture, because it just wasn't accessible to me really in where I lived. And then of course I've had a physical job for a long time, and then too much movement on top of that was just not really there. Like not needed. But that said, there was probably times where if I had done something like Pilates in my 20s, I think I would have been a better rider, or I'd had a stronger body and been less prone to, injuries, like even at like work, or like, and I talk about not big injuries, but like smaller, like strains, or, that kind of stuff. If I had been thinking about taking care of my body better at that time.
Yeah. That's one thing like I would say a lot, and even if, I'm a PT and I'm like, you mightn't like the gym, fine. Like that's okay. There's plenty of ways you can do stuff. Join a dance class, join a sport, do something like that, go for a walk with your friends, walking groups. Like these are all ways that you can get active without having to use gym. But also I kind of have a theory that a lot of people who don't like the gym don't actually not like it. They don't like what it represents, how they feel, that kind of thing. So it's not necessarily that they hate that form of exercise. It's always been associated with this negative, you feel bad, you should go to the gym. People are looking at you, you need to lose weight. And that I think puts more people off than the actual physical effort of sitting on the spin bike or doing the workout.
I agree. And I think that's why having trainers who are weight inclusive and can sort of inspire people to, just for the sheer joy that can come from the experience of moving your body and, exerting yourself in ways that are still safe. Because, most of us, and like how I work today is mostly in front of a computer screen, and I sit a lot, and I don't have that physical exhaustion as I did when I was working outdoors for like 8 to 10 hours a day. So I think that is probably something we need as humans as well, to like, work out and like use our bodies. And there can be something really satisfying that comes from that experience. But that's very different to when it's coupled with like repenting something you ate, or trying to burn a certain amount of calories, or having a very strict sort of weight loss goal in terms of numbers and stuff. That can kind of it can take from that experience of actually what it feels like when you're using your body in different ways and new ways.
Yeah, like one of my favorite things will be when I see clients and I go on, lift it a bit heavier or something like that. And they're like, I can't do that. I'm like, go on, do it. And then they do it. And they're like, oh my God, I didn't think I could do that. And that to me is way more better than if they told me that they lost 5 pounds, do you know what I mean? Or whatever, whatever, kilo, 2 kilos. I'm like, class. Well done. But look at that. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. It's exciting to know that your body is capable too.
yeah, it's way more empowering than seeing the weight go down, I think.
I think so. And I think if it isn't, it's something that's important to cultivate, because that number in the scale is very, it can fluctuate. It's quite elusive. And if we hang our self-worth on something as unstable as that, these were on very shaky ground with our own sense of self-worth, I think. But again, it's easier to understand why we get sucked into that, because it's everywhere. And it's even sometimes subtle messages that it's hard to see it when you are not aware, but usually once you've seen it, it's hard to unsee it. But like, yeah, and I think it's amplified with social media today, because like when I grew up, you'd be seeing the skinny girls in the magazines and stuff, or on TV. But it was to that, and you kind of knew, like, well, they were on a piece of paper and they weren't in our pockets all the time. And also, it wasn't people like that you could identify, or I couldn't identify with those. Like, my life was entirely different, even if I would still want to aspire to a body that looked like that. It was still kind of, and
Not real.
no, not really real. But now, if you're looking at your friends or people in the same age group as you and have similar lives, and even when people use filters, it's like we know that these things are airbrushed and filtered, but our brain cannot comprehend that fact. It just takes it as face value. So what that sort of does to, and I think it's even more dangerous if we're using filters on our own face, because like it's like the phone isn't a mirror, and even when you look in a mirror, that could also be distorted. So it's like, I don't know. I don't know what the research says, but like how filters really affect our brains and our perceptions of ourselves and of other bodies, but I don't think it's good.
No, there's definitely things like that where like people using Facetune and stuff like that, and it really starts to mess with how they feel about themselves. Like myself, like posting on social media, I used to do it whatever way, and now I feel like I have to put makeup on all the time because I feel more self-conscious, and I'll just put like because I've bad skin, so it annoys me. So like even just to make sure that's gone, it's not like a full face, but it's something I now know I do because I'm worried about how I look.
Yeah. It's something to be aware of, I think, and how we see that. And because it's kind of like if we don't see ourselves reflected back, right? If there's no reflective surfaces and we're just living in our bodies from the inside out, what feels like what becomes most important is how that feels. And that, there's discomfort, that can be discomfort in that too, but we can work on, how can I make myself more comfortable? And like you talk about lifting weights and you can feel it and you can, you become more connected with your body. But when we're looking at ourselves, and our reflection, we just by default objectifying ourselves because we're looking at ourselves from the outside in, which is an unnatural perspective. Because you know if you think back, like I sometimes wonder, like, what was it like when people had no mirrors before somebody invented that? Like when
Yeah.
you might see your reflection somewhat, maybe I don't know, in water or something like that. But it's like now we even have these stuff back on our phones. So it's like, and then you can do things to your face and it doesn't even look like your face. And you're like, but you'd still think that's me because that's what I'm seeing, but it's not actually what it is.
And then you're like, oh my God, why don't I actually look like that when you see a real mirror? And you're like, because you never looked like that.
No, and that discrepancy then really, I think, does a number on our sense of self, like in ways that if we do a lot of that, they could see why people then feel like you could never be satisfied because you simply don't look like that.
Yeah. Oh, it's just crazy the layers it goes into, isn't it?
It is. And I suppose the best way for young people is to be aware and to notice um, what happens. Because I remember I was working with one young person and she did notice, like, the more she used her phone, the worse she felt about herself. And there was a strong correlation with that. So when she limited her phone use or drastically reduced it, her self-confidence actually improved.
Yeah.
So it's something to, I think it's for all of us. I'm not 20 anymore, but I think it's still something to hold in mind that there's benefits for that, but there's also like how if it makes us feel worse, is it just like, do we need to put our attention elsewhere for a while?
Yeah, no, you're right. And it is that thing you do when you're like in a bad mood, isn't it? So like you just scroll on your phone sometimes and you're actually like adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah. And another thing on that I've noticed now as I moved into my 40s, I was like it's hard to imagine that when you're not there. And I have friends that are 10, 15 years older than me, but it's all of a sudden, it's just a little shift that you notice that the people you see represented around you are starting to, are now 10 to 20 years younger than you. And there's less and less representation. Like if I was scrolling on my feed, like how long, and of course it's curated because it's by people I follow, how long do I have to scroll before I see somebody my own age? This is a friend of mine that is roughly the same age, but like in media or somebody that's older.
Yeah.
It's like it would take a while.
Yeah, that's true actually. You're definitely younger than me these days as well. Or in around
Yeah.
my, I'm just hoping they're my age.
And you'd kind of, yeah. And I didn't notice so much in my 30s, but all of a sudden when I moved into my 40s, it's like it became much more apparent then that all of a sudden it's like oh, there's not that many. Or even like if you're, I don't read women's magazine, but like if you're flicking through that, you might see like one or two interviews by, say, like a famous actress, maybe in her 50s or 60s, but then the rest of it would just be full of 20-year-olds, you know, young people. And this kind of sends as well that we have to continue to uphold this sense of youth all the time. Like even when people are in their 60s or 70s, they're still supposed to have bodies that are like 25 or 30. You know, it's just a bit insane. But
Yeah.
those are all theirs. And I think I've just become much more aware of it through reading and education and conversations and stuff. And that helps for my own sense of my relationship with my body and my body image.
Yeah. And really awareness is the first step to everything.
I
So
agree.
that. So as well, coming back to, the clients you work with and stuff like that, is there any, I know it's kind of, there tends to be a case by case basis, but is there any kind of techniques you find with them that really helps them?
Yeah, I suppose it depends on, yeah, again, the person, but like very broad things that works for a lot of people, I think, is regular eating, adequate eating, making sure, and sometimes that's much more than you think you should have. And 1,200 calories a day, it really isn't adequate eating. And I think we tend to notice like if we're eating enough, we have better balanced mood, more even energy, we might sleep better, don't feel like a little bit less anxious, because unless you have like proper anxiety, but it's sort of a low level, it's there because your body's hungry. So those things on the more sort of emotional spectrum, I would say working on acceptance, awareness, like you said, using curiosity, and really meeting ourselves with kindness and compassion as much as we can. Like being really kind towards ourselves tends to help, even though it sounds like a complete paradox, because most of us think like we have a discipline problem, which I think sometimes what we have is a self-compassion deficiency problem more so, because
Yeah,
most people I work with, I said the vast majority are very, very hard on themselves. Um, so yeah. And obviously if that worked, it probably would have worked a long time ago.
that's true. Do you think you ever fully recover from these kind of?
That's another really great question. I mean, I think what full recovery means might be different from person to person and depends on the context in which you struggle, and also maybe how long it's been going on for. And I think it's important for each person to define for themselves what do I consider full recovery. So for me, being able to freely eat whatever I want when I want it, knowing that I can trust myself to stop eating when I had enough, knowing that I can mostly reliable eat foods like when I'm hungry and not sort of trying to override it and fix it. And just like not worrying about food all the time and having a lot of time spent worrying about my body and trying to manipulate it and fix it and spending a lot of time on those things, but actually being able to instead like enjoy life in my body and through my body and doing things with my body as opposed to it. That's how I think about it for what's my sense of full recovery. But that said, I do know that I can never ever go on a restrictive diet. And should I have to do a restrictive diet for medical reasons, or if I became allergic to something or developed celiac disease or something like that, I would have to be very, very careful, because because I know there's a vulnerability there. And I think particularly people who've had like restrictive eating disorders and heal from that, they can't do another diet. Like calorie deficits for somebody like that can mean like an easy path into what could even turn into a full-blown relapse, because there is already vulnerability there. Otherwise, like I remember giving a talk years ago. Sometimes I do talk to corporates and stuff, and a person who said, I never really diet. Oh, I tried once, but like it just wasn't for me. And it's like, just it wasn't that interested. I thought it was boring, or I was just hungry. So I just went back to like that happens, and those people are very lucky, but sometimes it happens. It's not like, yes, it can be all kinds of things that get somebody going, but sometimes it can be as innocuous as, I just wanted to lose a few pounds, and next thing it became a full-blown eating disorder, like because there was already vulnerability there. Or somebody's like, yeah, I just trying to eat better and work out, and I was restricting, and next thing it's like you're back in the cycle of like restricting and binge eating, and you're thinking, God, I'm not very good at this dieting thing, so I need to sort this, but it's because you're restricting, you're not eating enough, or you're trying to control what you're eating and cutting things out, and that awakens whatever, an inner rebel, or just like your body's hungry.
Yeah.
So like it's not, I think it's really important to remember that dieting is not the only cause, but it's the leading cause of people developing disordered eating and eating disorders. So it's not harmless.
Well, especially with some of the diets that are out there, like, unfortunately, the eat, balanced, a good nutritious diet, try not to eat far too much or whatever, blah, blah, blah. Doesn't sell more than cut out carbs and you lose 10 pounds in a week.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's kind of almost a losing battle in that way. And if people have already done that, and I always say this to people, you see people go back to the same diets over and over again because it worked.
Yeah, it worked once. But like the across the board, the science is pretty clear. And there's a woman called Ragan Chastain. She has a very good newsletter called the Weight and Health Newsletter. And she did a post looking at 30 years of weight loss research. And pretty much none of the studies were showing any success beyond 2 to 5 years for maybe a tiny minority. And these were different types of, whether it was calorie restricted diets, whether it was weight loss surgery, whether there was like, more kind of intense, like zero carbs, like those types of, like, it's just like our bodies, they don't want to be in a calorie deficit or an energy deficit for a long time. It's just not conducive to survival. So it finds ways to hold on to whatever, or to regain the weight as soon as food becomes available. It's like survival stuff.
Yeah.
It's like a lot of it is physiology, but then it's blamed as psychology. It's like, oh, well, I just couldn't stick to it long term, because maybe you couldn't because you were too hungry. But also, even if you can stick to it long term, either you'd end up with a restrictive eating disorder, which could kill you. And I've also worked with people who had restrictive eating disorders for decades, who had consistently gained weight, even though they were eating very little.
Yeah.
So it's just not that straightforward, because from our body's perspective, their main job is to keep us alive for as long as possible. So they do what they have to do.
Yeah, that's fair. One thing I always find interesting is that one when they do say, like, well, it worked. I'm like, okay, so why are you doing it again then? If it worked, you wouldn't have to go back to it.
Exactly. Like if dieting worked, we should only have to do it once.
Yeah.
And that sort of refutes the thing as well, with like that our bodies are living, breathing beings. They're malleable, they're changeable. They do work like that. And because, apart from the media messaging we're getting, and if you start thinking about, if you really start looking at what you've been fed on your Instagram feed, and like the age profile and the body type profile, you'd get a sort of sense of image that health looks a specific way too. But like our bodies, like most people when they're in their 60s don't look like they're 20, because they lived 40 more years. So it's just, so I just feel like, could we just sort of like not focus on that and just bring back like what does like feels like good health, or self-care. Like there's nothing wrong with moving your body. Like that can be a really good thing and supportive in so many ways. But it's like it just becomes, but it's only the means to this end of manipulating your body. And it's like, if your body doesn't change as a result, then it's like wasted. But it's not, because it can have all sorts of benefits, mentally, physically, socially. Like, if you enjoy, you play sport with a group of people you like, or you have your gym pals, or you go for walks with your friends, like, it's so beneficial. but it's like it just becomes boxed in, just like eating fruit and vegetables, like, or, you know, wholesome food. It's like just it's enjoyable. If it's enjoyable, it's accessible, it can be extremely nourishing beyond just the micromanagement of the nutrients, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I fully agree. I think that is everything I have to ask you, Linn. However, I do have one question to like to ask everyone at the end of every podcast, and that is, what is the best advice you've ever been given?
God, that's such a hard question.
I
I don't
love this. I
know.
always get this response. You can pick like
Oh God,
3 if you want.
3. Do you know what? I always think about something, and no, it's not advice, but I'm just going with something that comes to mind right now. It's like when I went to silent retreat, and the meditation teacher, she was kind of like, very like, well, it can be this way or that way, and either way it's fine. And just this kind of spacious openness of being curious and not so attached, I think, has been very helpful in many ways. Just to be, oh, that's interesting, and just okay, see where that goes. But that was something that stuck out. Where it was like, okay, yeah, you think one way is bad and one way is good, but like either way might just be fine.
I love that. It is so simple and just so easily forgotten, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. So I just go with that. I don't have any other kind of clear cuts. And for my advice for myself in relation to my relationship with food and eating my body was definitely to get off the scales. That was a big one.
That is, yeah. I think a lot of people need to get away from them.
Yes.
So with that, I think I want to thank you for joining me today, Linn. Would you like to tell everyone where they can find you?
Yeah, for sure. And thanks for having me. I know the conversation went all over the place. So people can find me on my website, which is straightforwardnutrition.com, or they can find me on my Instagram page, which is at healing_relationship_with_food, or they can find me on my podcast, the Joyful Nourishment Podcast.
Brilliant. And just for anyone looking to find me, as ever, you will find me most often on my Instagram. It's at strong in the saddle with an _. Also, I'm on TikTok at strong in the saddle without the underscore because I got there first. And my website is www.chrissyhawkins.com. So again, just thanks for joining us again, Linn. It was really, really interesting conversation. I love where it went.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Christy.
I really do appreciate everybody who listens to this podcast. So if you please could help me with the algorithm and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And even, you know, if you want to reach out and suggest topics for me, I'd be delighted to hear from you. Drop me a DM on Instagram or TikTok. And thanks again for listening.